Kappo and the Rev present a KaTR Classic, Anne of Green Gables. Chapter 1, Rachel Lynde is surprised. In the beginning, the Queen created Canada, and Canada begat Prince Edward Island. And upon that beautiful island, full of alders and ladies' eardrops, there was a woods, and running through that woods was the brook that unwittingly made its way past Mrs. Rachel Lynde.
Now, Kappo, if you followed that brook up a ways towards the Cuthbert place, which the locals called Green Gables, and was tucked as far back into the woods as the homestead could be pushed without retreating into the wilds altogether. The brook ran headlong, seemingly uphill away from Rachel Lynde and her more civilized society she kept by the crossroads of Avonlea, where her gaze currently waned.
It was then that Matthew Cuthbert drove by. Rachel Lynde snapped her neck sideways and ejaculated,
"Thomas? Is that man stealing the Cuthbert sorrel mare and buggy?" Thomas Lynde replied kindly,
Well, Rachel, I've lived down here from the Cuthberts for nearly 50 years now, and the only man I've ever seen drive that mare's Matthew. I doubt she'd drop a hoof for anyone other than that queer old Cuthbert.
Rachel, nearly flying from her trussels, was out in the center of the dirt road before the dust could settle, and sure enough, there was Matthew, shock of white hair streaming behind the carriage. Rachel huffed.
"Well, not so much as a nod or a tip of the cap, and dressed like that as if he was off to see the Reverend Allen. Matthew never goes to town this time of year. Oh, by the withering pussy willow, I simply must go see Marilla." Thomas Lynde coughed, saying nothing, yet he drew the glare of Rachel, and she adjusted her girdle and started towards Green Gables. Thomas Lynde, meekly like a church mouse, said to a cat,
Rachel, dear.
"Thomas!"
Rachel interrupted.
"I simply won't hear another exposit on Psalms chapter 101, verse 5. I simply want to find out if my dear, sweet friend Marilla is in need."
He wasn't going fast enough for a doctor. I simply wanted to tell you.
"Tell me what?"
You stepped in shit on the road there.
In new boots, Rachel, with the corners of her mouth twitching like the knob of a clicking telegraph, was fairly bursting up the avenue towards Green Gables. The nameless avenue that ran alongside the brook, that seemed so meek and proper in her estate, yet halfway to Green Gables it turned into a laughing, babbling creek with dark secrets of pool and cascade. It was simply unacceptable to Rachel's sensibilities, so she stated for none more than herself, her savior, and the lonely waters.
"Whoso privily slandereth his neighbor, him will I cut off. Him that hath a high look and a proud heart will not I suffer."
From there, one could steal their first look of Green Gables. Marilla looked to be bent low over the garden. As Rachel drew closer, she thought it odd to be gardening at such an hour. It was simply unheard of. So Rachel called to Marilla.
"Marilla! It's far too early in the season to be removing the cucumbers!"
With that, a startled Marilla Cuthbert disappeared around the east gable, as if she didn't hear the bloviate cry of her portly and nosy neighbor.
By the time Rachel Lynde had reached the doors of Green Gables, Marilla had composed herself and placed the tea kettle on the cold stove.
Rachel, propping the screen door open with her new boots, which truthfully she hadn't planned on donning until late season.
"Yoo-hoo! Marilla!"
Marilla Cuthbert was always prepared for a visit from her longtime neighbor and part-time friend, Rachel Lynde. A tea set meticulously placed with marmalade and the morning's biscuits was by the ready by 10:45 a.m. 7 days a week at Green Gables, even though the two only shared tea but perhaps 3 times a week.
Marilla whisks around the well-kept corner of the painfully clean kitchen, tea service in hand, and asks, as she has asked every time Rachel appeared at her door,
"And how are all the Lyndes?"
"We are fine, Marilla,"
Rachel said, taking considerable notice of Marilla's somewhat disheveled appearance. Cheeks that normally sank seemed buoyed by a rosy tint, and eyes that by this time of the day would look tired seemed bright and full of anxiety.
"I had worried over you and your headaches when I saw your brother drive by just now." Marilla had been enjoying a rare private moment in her garden that had now been spoiled by the somewhat expected yet uninvited visit. She was perhaps spending the last peaceful moments at Green Gables, knowing that they would soon have a new arrival. This moment was now bursted by the looming fact that Marilla was going to have to share this news with Rachel, and now, of all times.
Rachel Lynde, it seems as if I should consult you as to what's going on here at Green Gables.
Marilla laughed like a fencer riposts. Marilla contrasted her sharp and gloomy appearance with a razor-sharp wit that few came to enjoy, as the parlor at the Cuthbert home hadn't entertained since the turn of the century.
Rachel responded,
When I see Matthew Cuthbert, dressed as if he's to address Parliament, driving past my gate without the tip of a cap, I feel it's my God-given duty to lay a kind eye on my Marilla Cuthbert, and if I know too much of you, take it as a blessing by divine providence.
Rachel?
Marilla interjected with a teacup extended before Rachel's very lip. She was either going to politely stop speaking or have the tea poured hot down her wagging gullet. Rachel opted for the former.
Matthew was going to Bright River. We're adopting an orphan boy from the asylum to help run the farm.
Marilla said flatly, giving way to the stone silence that followed. Marilla C. Cuthbert!
Rachel shouted, turning Marilla on her heel, having not been called her full name since her father had died some 45 years ago.
Marilla felt instantly as if she were again that homely 12-year-old girl being harassed and harangued by her plump and excitable neighbor Rachel. This was the definition of their friendship, and over the years it had hardened Marilla to accepting a frightening display of ignorance and arrogance, and yet dutifully keeping her course. Marilla betrayed none of her inner thought and explained calmly,
Matthew is getting along in years, and it is so seldom that he sets his mind to anything. I felt it my Christian duty to go along with it.
Their eyes met again in a cold and meaningful stare, both attempting to do their godly duties and accomplishing little other than trespassing on each other.
I heard tell of an orphan child
Rachel began, far more experienced in trespass and prophesizing,
who set fire to the home while the family slept, burnt them to a crisp in their beds.
Marilla's eyes were growing wide, not at the content of this anecdote, but at the sheer magnitude of Rachel's gall in continuing.
Well, last year in Hopeton, an orphan child put strychnine in the well. The entire family died in agony. Only it was a girl in that case. Marilla said sternly,
We are not getting a girl.